of the Women in Politics Institute, Candace Nelson, and the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies, the School of Public Affairs, and American University, I'd like to welcome you to today's event. I'm Jennifer Lawless, the director of the Women in Politics Institute, and I'm thrilled to moderate what I'm sure is going to be a terrific panel to end Women's History Month. Frankly, I don't actually think it could have come at a better time. You would basically have to be living under a rock right now not to notice party polarization, legislative gridlock, and all-around government dysfunction. Just consider what the average viewer sees when perusing the newspaper, surfing the internet, or flipping through the channels. Media headlines typically and cynically pronounce the failures of the political system as business as usual. The government shutdown in the fall serves as the most obvious example. From furloughed workers to disgruntled tourists, many Americans experienced firsthand the consequences of Washington politicians' inability to pass the federal budget. They also experienced around-the-clock coverage of the shutdown, and it reinforced the worst motives and characteristics that they might perceive in elected leaders. The Daily News on the first day of the shutdown ran the headline "House of Turds" over a picture of House Speaker John Boehner. The Washington Post went with, "In shutdown blame game, Democrats and Republicans are united, it's the other side's fault." And the Post style section actually was a bit more dramatic. They had a darkened Capitol building overlaid with the word "UGG." When the government reopened 16 days later, a debate immediately commenced over raising the debt ceiling. NBC Nightly News anchor Brian Williams opened his broadcast by saying, "Another day of partisan sniping in Washington, it's business as usual." And a CNN.com headline blared, "The biggest threat to the U.S. economy, Washington dysfunction." Assessments like these have become standard practice in how professional journalists and the media in general describe national politics. And although we can debate their accuracy, we can't really question their ubiquity. This morning, I did a quick LexisNexis search of major newspapers and broadcast news transcripts. Here's what I found. This is just for 2013. 472 news stories that mentioned in the title partisan warfare, 412 that said partisan bickering, and 344 that said Washington dysfunction. And these derisive indicators don't even begin to approach the level of negativity or condemnation that typically characterize politics on the blogosphere or talk radio. Now, not surprisingly, the political climate has culminated in the most negative public attitudes toward government since the advent of modern polling. Not even 1 in 5 voters trusts government to do what's right most of the time. Congressional approval is down to 9%. Senator John McCain actually joked that Congress is down to paid staffers and blood relatives approving of the job they do. His quip, though, is actually not far off the mark. In early 2013, there was a survey conducted where public policy polling asked people whether they had a more favorable impression of the U.S. Congress or someone or something else that was generally unpopular. The results of these 26 head-to-head matchups, while amusing, are a devastating indictment. This is a true story. Citizens rated root canals, traffic jams, cockroaches, and used car salesmen higher than they did members of Congress. Now, members of the House and Senate might take solace in knowing that they rated more highly than playground bullies, telemarketers, North Korea, and meth labs. Or maybe not, because in several cases the margin was quite close. Political analysts often trace the current period of dysfunction to the modern Republican Party's strategy of running against the government in Washington. Iconic of this strategy was a 1986 press conference at which President Ronald Reagan asserted that the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." The assault on government ramped up considerably with the midterm elections of 1994. Voters gave Republicans control of the U.S. House of Representatives, and for the first time in 40 years, and Newt Gingrich ascended to Speaker of the House. He brought to the position not only a desire to slash the size of the federal government, but also a confrontational style that led to repeated showdowns with Democrats and the president. And since then, partisan wars have become the norm. Yet amidst all of this dysfunction, many have argued that there is some silver lining. For a long time, there's been speculation and anecdotal evidence that women in power function differently than men, more collaboratively, and more effectively. It was women on both sides of the aisle who many reporters credited with ultimately ending the government shutdown. And women who now chair or sit as ranking members of 10 of the Senate's 20 committees can take more than partial credit for passing the budget, the transportation bill, the farm bill, the Water Resources Development Act, and the Violence Against Women Act. Indeed, John McCain has a better attitude toward his female colleagues than his overall colleagues. He said, "I'm very proud that these women are stepping forward. Imagine what they could do if there were 50 of them." And this afternoon we'll do just that. I can't think of a better group of people to discuss the current state of affairs in Washington how we got here, and whether more women in politics might be a way to get us out. And because I want to spend the bulk of the time hearing from the panelists, I'm going to keep my introductions of them short. Mickey Edwards represented Oklahoma's 5th Congressional District from 1977 to 1993. A founding trustee of the Heritage Foundation, he has taught at Harvard and Princeton, and currently serves as vice president and director of the Aspen Institute's Political Leadership Program. He's a regular political commentator, and his most recent book is entitled The Parties versus the People: How to Turn Republicans and Democrats into Americans, which was published in 2012 by Yale University Press. Barbara Kennelly represented Connecticut's 1st Congressional District from 1982 to 1999. Since then, she has served as the Associate Commissioner and Counselor to the Commissioner of the Social Security Administration, the President and CEO of the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare, and is a Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Trinity Washington University. She is also the president of her own lobbying firm, Barbara Kennelly Associates. I should also note that in the spring of 1996, I interned in her office in Washington, D.C. I was very young.
So was I.
Nancy Johnson also served as a member of the House from Connecticut from 1983 to 2007. She was a senior member of the Ways and Means Committee and played a pivotal role in passing tax bills, trade agreements, and health information technology legislation. Since leaving Congress, she joined Baker Donaldson as a senior policy advisor, where she lobbies on issues ranging from tax and trade to healthcare policy. Our final panelist is Sean Theriault, an associate professor of government at the University of Texas and the author of The Gingrich Senators: The Roots of Partisan Warfare in Congress. In the interest of full disclosure, I should also note that he's one of my best friends. We probably would have him here today anyway, though. Truth be told, he's an expert in the field. He has a PhD from Stanford, has written 3 books about the U.S. Congress, along with numerous academic articles, and regularly offers political analysis and commentary. Perhaps most impressively, at any point in time, he can name between 95 and 100 U.S. senators. No, seriously, ask him. He can just No one found that feeling? I find that endearing. Okay. In short, you're about to hear from a great panel, and there will be time for questions at the end. And so I would now ask each of the panelists to come up. And I think the best place to begin is with Sean. If you can be our first panelist and just give us a little bit of a summary of your book and the reasons that it's relevant in today's political climate. So that everybody can come up in the order.
Just set it up.
I did the table. I got it.
You can probably.
Yeah, I got it. Sorry that I had some problems with the camera. The story is that I'm missing class right now. And so the way that I'm going to make my students pay for not having to hear me talk today is that I'm going to tape this, and then they're going to have to watch it on their own time. And then I'll test them on it a couple of weeks later. So at first I wanted to thank Jen for putting this panel together. It's uniquely timed for what's taking place in Washington. And as she said, I can't imagine better panelists, except of course for me, to discuss this issue with. So I especially want to thank Congressman Mickey Edwards and Congresswoman Barbara Kennelly and Nancy Johnson for being here. I noticed that there are some students in the audience, so I thought that I would take just a little bit of a step back and explain a little bit about what we mean when we talk about party polarization. So if we think of Democrats and Republicans serving in the House or the Senate, if they agreed on a particular issue and all of them voted the same way, of course, party polarization would be 0. If we had every Democrat voting against every Republican, party polarization, of course, would be 100%. And so to give you a bit of a flavor of how party polarization has changed over time, I thought I would share with you the party polarization level at various periods in time. So when Jen was born, party polarization in the U.S. House was 28%. When Mickey Edwards started serving in Congress, you'll notice that the percentage is about the same at 28%, indicative of those dates being pretty similar. When Barbara started serving in the U.S. House, it was 29%. And then Nancy came a year later, and it was 30%. By the time Mickey left in 1992, it was 37%. When Barbara left, it was 46%. And then finally, when Nancy left, it was 50%. In the last Congress, it was 57%. So just over the course of Jen's lifetime, party polarization in the U.S. House is more than double. I think she's the cause.
It's actually kind of possible.
When you talk to political scientists or political commentators or you read newspapers about party polarization, they'll generally give you 3 different explanations for why the parties are polarized so much. The first one, and I would say the favorite, is because of redistricting. If only we had districts that reflected the balance in the country, then everything would be fine in the U.S. House. The second explanation that you get is geographic sorting. That you have people who are purposefully living in regions that then correspond with the way that they practice their politics. So if you're into good coffee shops and a downtown vibrant scene, then you're going to move to the urban core. If you're more interested in low taxes and good schools, then you move out to the suburbs. And those things are correlated with politics. And then the third is that leadership is really important. And leaders today are more powerful than they have been in the past. And all of those explanations are true, especially as we think about the U.S. House. But the puzzle here is that none of those really work with the U.S. Senate. In the Senate, we don't go through redistricting. It's far easier to move from here to Montgomery County than it is to move from here to Oklahoma, for example. We've always known that the Speaker is particularly powerful, but the Senate Majority Leader and the Senate Minority Leaders aren't nearly as powerful relative to the rest of their caucus. But yet, when we look at party polarization in the Senate, we see that it's almost the exact same extent as the U.S. House. And so that's really where I begin the book. And so I say, well, why is it then that party polarization in the Senate is almost as bad as the House? And the explanation that I come up with is a group of folks that I call the Gingrich Senators. And the reason I call them the Gingrich Senators is because I noticed through my own analysis that when Newt Gingrich enters the U.S. House, there's a different type of member that becomes elected. And so I define the Gingrich Senators as all sharing three characteristics. The first is that they're Republican. The second is that they're elected after 1978, the year in which Newt Gingrich is elected to the House. And the third is that they serve in the House first. And it's the combination of these three characteristics that leads someone to exercising uniquely distinct behavior in the U.S. Senate. So for example, of those people in the Republican conference who served in the House first and entered the House after 1978, they're twice as conservative as the other Republicans who are currently serving in the Senate. And not only are they more conservative, but they are much less likely to co-sponsor Democratic bills. They're much more likely to filibuster bills that are on the Senate floor, and they're much less likely to support Democratic presidential appointees. And I should say that all of those statistics are true even when we control for their ideology. So even that they're already very conservative, once we control for their conservative nature, they go a step further in opposing Democratic leaders. And what we find particularly is that their behavior is most distinct from the other Republicans when they are serving in the minority. So when the Republican is the majority party, we find that they act like the other Republicans. But when they're in the minority party is when their behavior becomes most distinct. Furthermore, they have actually implemented new strategies in the U.S. Senate that we see now being shared by the rest of the other Republicans and even the Democrats. There's a new kind of strategy going on in the U.S. Senate where they try to kill bills now by offering endless amounts of amendments. And we find that the culprit of offering most of these amendments are in fact the Gingrich Senators. Furthermore, the Gingrich Senators are more likely to be behind stymied negotiations. And the two examples that I offer in great length in the book are talking about Don't Ask, Don't Tell with respect to Senator McCain, and then the New START Treaty with Senator Kyle. And what's true is that they outline at the beginning of these debates all of the things that they need in order for them to finally vote in favor of New START and repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And at every step, the Democrats or the president offer them all of the things that they want, and yet they still oppose them. And they come up with a new set of reasons and a new set of explanations that they need to be satisfied. And finally, I'll end my introductory remarks by talking about a particular situation that happened a couple of years ago. Al Franken, who some of you might know from Saturday Night Live, is serving in the Senate, and he's recognizing that the Senate is in such dire straits that he needs to change the dynamic. And he remembered back to his 5th grade classroom. And he said, maybe if I implement the exact same strategy that my 5th grade teacher did, then maybe things in the Senate will start to change. He recognized that the Senate is as the Senate is, and so he said, this idea is going to be even better if I get a Republican co-sponsor. So he gets a Republican co-sponsor, Senator Joe Hans from Nebraska, and the two of them send out a press release and send a letter to all of the U.S. senators. And what is their great idea? To hold a secret Santa. So they're going to get all the senators together, they're going to exchange presents, they're going to enjoy just each other's company. But of course this idea is only going to work if people show up. Well, they send out the letter, they have the appointed time and date in the room, and 60% of the U.S. Senate shows up. 70% of Democrats show up. 67% of other Republicans show up. 25% of the Gingrich senators show up. So they're just much less willing to even engage in the social aspects of the U.S. Senate. So with that, I'll turn my comments over to the real experts on Congress, the people that serve there.
Well, I'm going to interrupt first.
Okay.
Okay, so there are rules that need to be followed. So I was now hoping that each of the former members of Congress could just take a few minutes to respond to Sean's basic argument, and if you can share your own impressions from when you were serving as to how this trend was unrolling or unraveling, that would be great. Do you want to just go down the aisle? Great.
Well, I'm a political animal, so when Newt Gingrich came to the House, when he came to the House, we all noticed. You always notice Newt. But when he became Speaker, I will never forget that day. I never saw such press attendance in my whole life. He was just surrounded by press, television cameras, and it was something to see. But he really, Newt is an actor in many ways, and he knew that he had to really show what he was about and what he was going to do. And you have to remember, Newt Gingrich put that gavel down after 40 years of Democratic politics. 40 years. So one really doesn't have to wonder why he thought, I'm really going to star. And of course he did. And he was fantastic. Because if it hadn't been for Newt, I am convinced it would have taken a much longer time for the Republicans to get into a stronger position. Now I have to say, I think he went a little far. I really think he went a little far. But Newt was a fascinating man. He was so, in your book, as your book said, he was so interested in the power going to the Republican Party. And he was so interested in being a leader of his party that being Speaker, as you said, was third. So you can almost see why his career went to that point, where it wasn't that long. But he certainly changed the climate. And I have to say to Sean that the book hits it right on the head. And I wrote Stand Up for My Party. The Watergate babies were a similar situation. But they weren't, when Newt took over the party, he had been the whip. He had got himself into leadership. Vin Weber, and maybe you know this so much, and Bob Walker and those people, they were bright. They were very, very bright. And they backed him up to the hill, and they were, they got themselves into leadership. So it is not, as one reads your book and one remembers as I do, it really follows through. Because Newt didn't think that was where he was going to stop. No, he waited till last year or 2 years ago to run for president, but that was always in his mind. That was always in his mind. And I have a feeling we're going to hear from Newt again. But when I said about the Watergate babies, you have to remember that the head of the Finance Committee right now, it was a Watergate baby. The head of the Farm Committee, who's not running again, was a Watergate baby. Then there were people there that brought forth people like your book says. I mean, Barbara Boxer, Dick Durbin. They all came from what were strategized into the Senate by the Watergate babies. And I always say that George Miller is an unsung hero because he literally had the strategy of how to say to Chuck Schumer, you should run for the Senate from New York, and this is how you're going to do it. Obviously, Barbara Boxer, he planned that, and he was a great power behind Nancy Pelosi. So there's no doubt, I think, you're right on in your book, but I also think members of a body who really care about the body, they can be very, very influential on what happens to those people to go on. So I love the book, and thank you for writing it.
Well, I have to say I love the book partly because Sean's a friend, but also because Sean and I are co-writing a textbook on Congress that is coming out soon if I do my part better than I have. So this was good. When Sean and I first talked about his thesis here, I completely agreed with it, that when people who had served in the House either with Newt or even after Newt was Speaker, but who had been part of this changed dynamic in the House, when they went on to the Senate, they took with them the confrontational ideas that they had generated in the House. I do think it's important to pick up on a point that Barbara was making that I agree with. is that while in my mind, I'm not as generous in my thoughts toward Newt as you are, Barbara. I think he's an idiot. But in fact, he didn't start it. You have to look at how it was that somebody like Newt became the speaker. And he became speaker, Barbara was talking about what had happened with the Watergate class of new members from 1974. And then when Tip O'Neill, who I enjoyed very much, I thought Tip was a tremendous Speaker of the House, and when he retired, and Jim Wright became Speaker, and I like Jim, but with Republicans in the White House, Jim felt that the way to make sure that they didn't lose more battles on the floor was to use closed rules that prevented the minority, in this case the Republicans, from being able to offer amendments to bring their bills to the floor. And the result of all that was that Newt, when he ran for whip, and he just barely won that position. Most of you would remember Denny Hastert was opposed to Newt being the leadership. Tom DeLay was opposed to it. Bob Michel, then the Republican leader, and of course I was too. But he was elected to be whip, which put him in a position to be speaker, most of it the support of the Republican moderates, not the conservatives. And it was because Newt said, after looking at what was happening with all the closed rules, and people who were the moderates weren't there for ideological reasons. They wanted to be governors. They wanted to help govern the country. They wanted to be players in setting policy. And when Newt said, we're going to fight back, we're going to stand toe-to-toe, and we're going to challenge the speaker, and we're going to do everything else using closed rules, and then ourselves, when we got there, also using the end of the session speeches on television to help drive an anti-Democrat and even anti-Congress message. The problem is that when Republicans then took control, became the majority, that continued. This whole sense of confrontation, party against party, constant warfare, continued. So I think, unlike some of the books that are out there, not Sean's, by the way, but some of the books that say it's all a Republican problem, and if Republicans just weren't crazy, then things would be better, that ignores a large part of the history that is underlying, the phenomenon that Sean has seen. So, yeah, I think it's a really good book, and I've seen pieces of it as he was writing it, and I think that all of you should buy this book. It really is quite right.
I have not read the book.
But you still recommend its purchase.
And I very deeply disagree with most of what's been said here. We tend to forget, when I came to Congress in 1983, I came from a Democrat-controlled legislature in Connecticut, but we had joint committees. So if you came to the committee and you learned from the testimony, you had input into the makeup of the bill. So frankly, I worked very closely with our Governor Ella Grasso on reorganization because I was on the right committee and her people were very knowledgeable. It didn't occur to me that because they were Democrats that I shouldn't pay attention. In fact, I was so naive that I volunteered to be chairman of the subcommittee and the chairman had to come over and tell me a day later that he couldn't do that. I mean, there was good reason why I volunteered, but it was just sort of equal distribution of the work. When I came to Congress, I was put on the Select Committee for Children, Youth, and Families. And I knew a lot about that. I'd done a lot of legislating in the area of foster care. It was the first big round of foster care reform and other things. And we had a lot of hearings. And we're writing a green book about children. And the first panel was children who said that their biggest fear was the fear of nuclear war. The third panel was a group of psychologists who said children's first fear was the fear of divorce. And at that time, my children were just emerging from high school, and boy, that divorce thing really rang true with me. That's what my kids' friends were afraid of, and that's what the anguish that they would share. So that's all right. It was the era of nuclear concern, and that's okay. But when I offered amendments, because that third panel had been completely ignored, I was prepared for this. I had done what I had done in the state senate. I reviewed all the testimony. So I had
references and pages that were I thought important points were left out of the Green Book. Was it just, nobody's going to read anyway, it's just a digest of all these things. Every one of those was voted down with proxies by the chairman. The only one who defended me was Lindy Bonds. It didn't help that she voted with me on a couple. But they were serious, they were substantive. They weren't partisan, they weren't political. And there was no argument against them, they were just voted down. Now, one of the things Newt did, and it's true, he got elected speaker with the help of the moderates. And one of the things he did, when I first went to my first committee meeting, Public Works and Transportation, we were told by the ranking member that he didn't know what the agenda was going to be because the Democrats hadn't told him. So let's get to know one another. Now, Newt made it his business in the leadership to task each ranking member to think about what is our agenda here? What do Republicans think about transportation? What are our priorities? And to me, that was extraordinarily helpful. And it was his first 6 years were extremely vital when we worked on, and remember, the Republicans who came to rule the committees were moderates. They were old timers. They were bill cleaners. They were people we knew and respected, and the Democrats knew and respected. And most of those bills passed with overwhelming majorities, large Democrat votes, because they were things that needed to be attended to. After that, the Republican Party became much too engaged in social issues, and that divided us. And so when I first became aware, though, of what was a very bad sign was when Dave Hobson said to me, boy, I don't know what's happening, but I heard a terrible conversation among Democrat staffers. Later on, I heard one myself. I mean, I've never heard such anger. I've never heard such personal hatred. And then as chairman of the Ethics Committee, later on, the triviality of the cases that were brought to the Ethics Committee, they were without substance. They were just out there to embarrass people, to ruin their careers. And we had to take everything seriously, and we looked into all of them, God bless us, But don't tell me it's the Republicans that brought all the rancor, because it wasn't. It is hard to change majority after 40 years. And Barbara's right, there was some benefit to it for both parties, but it did go awry. And the divisions within the Republican Party were very destructive because they were all about social issues. They were destructive from my point of view because I didn't agree with any of them. It was nothing that we should be allowed to. But what my real point is that I think what was said at the opening is a big part of the problem. The press is a big part of the problem. The division isn't partisan. The parties have always differed on certain issues. The difference is substantive. And what's made it so angry are some process issues. I mean, one of the reasons the Senate is now going the direction of the House is that Reid has not voted one bill that has come out of the House, not one, for years. And he fills up the amendment tree before he takes anything to the floor. The Senate Republicans have absolutely no voice in the Democratic Party. And that's why you can call him Gingrich. And he did teach them how to fight that. But that is not America. And that is not the way the Senate has always worked. So there's a lot of real reasons for the anger. But in my estimation, what we're all overlooking is that the division is substantive and profound. It started out as a division about deficits. And when we balanced the budget, it was in a growing economy. And frankly, Democrats as well as Republicans thought we ought to do it, and Clinton finally signed it on. We did it actually together in the end, but the Republicans were the motive energy. But now, the issue of the deficit is a much bigger issue, and it's a very deadly, serious issue. If you read the report of the bipartisan committee President Obama, appointed with very top guys that we all respected, you can't help but be concerned about our future. Now it's gone from bad to worse. There are certain people in that contingent of no votes in the Republican Party are people who said, nobody lives this way and you can't live this way. So I don't care what you want to spend it on. I'm not going to pay $1.50 over the course of the expenditure and the loan repay for that. We can't do it. And that's why they're so down pay as you go. But it's not just the debt. See, the debt was fiery, and balancing the budget, that's a nice political issue. But the reason it's so paralyzing now, and in my mind it's good we're paralyzed, because we as a people deeply disagree on the role of federal power in our lives. In a federalist system, remember, the federal government originally, I used to tell this to school groups, the difference between being your state senator, honey, and being here is that I do foreign policy and armed services. I think about strategy and weapons and so on, and I never had to do that as your state senator. I think about foreign policy. But we're now doing too many things in my mind that are all too much like the state legislature. And having chaired committees on foster care nationwide and on health care nationwide, I can tell you there's such a huge difference in infrastructure and values across the country that this divide is real and profound. We ought to be much more interested in it. We ought to be talking about it. We ought to be working it out. And if my view is that there's enough support for universal coverage for health care that if this had gone through the legislative process, we could have gotten a bill. Because when Hillary Clinton led the first investigation of health care, the Democrats had a big group who were really interested. The Republicans had a big group, like 20 each. And there was a bipartisan bill with Dr. Rowland from Georgia and Bob Michael. And it involved exchanges. It involved a lot of the things. And it's at one point had a mandate, and then we had to back off of that because there's a lot of reasons why in the end it just doesn't work. But there were substitutes for that. But when it was not allowed to come to the floor before August, it was to be brought up after the recess, and I think after the recess they all realized it was going to pass. And there were some who didn't want it to pass before the Clinton re-election because they thought it would be a rejection of it. I understand that in a book that Hillary's written lately, they wanted any health care bill because that would have been victory. So there are ways to do these things, and I would personally maintain that the problems the Affordable Care Act are because snags weren't worked out. So there are two issues that I think we really ought to be focused on. We are not listening to each other, and we do not respect the opinions of people who differ significantly from ours. So we're just, for the first time I've ever seen in politics in America, we're just divided. And in those circumstances, people on both sides hate. I mean, I could tell you stories about the ruthlessness of the other side that I never saw on our side when there was any sign of bipartisan action. So we are in profound difficulty. But if we think it's just about politics as a game in business, we're off track. It's about how profoundly different parts of our country view federal power and what it means to them to be free and responsible and have the opportunity that the United States has traditionally offered. So don't expect this to end soon. We aren't even talking about the right things.
Okay.
Sorry about that, but I just had to say it because
I think we're all very sad now too. So the silver lining, at least as been put out there, is that at least in the government shutdown discussion, we saw that the final reconciliation was brought about in large part because of women on both sides of the aisle. So if we could just spend, because we are celebrating Women's History Month, even though there were no female Gingrich senators, if we could just spend a couple of minutes talking about the role of women in not only legislating, but also maybe listening to each other or forging coalitions or bringing about at least some degree of progress that we haven't previously seen, that would be great. So should we just come down the aisle again, or we can go backwards?
I do think the women in the Senate have performed magnificently. I think the number of Democrat women who are chairing important committees is unprecedented, and that they're doing a very nice job. I think Mikulski did an absolutely remarkable job as chairman of appropriations. She had a good partner in Hal Rogers, but she did a very fine job. I think Susan Collins has just been amazing in her ability to speak up, and she has now 8 people from each party, 8 Democrats and 8 Republicans, and they have dinner together and they make their decisions. And remember, McCain did this with judicial appointments. So it's nice to see women stepping up and providing that kind of leadership. And I'm very hopeful that what we're seeing actually is the demise of the Reed style of leadership.
Nikki?
Yeah, well, I think Susan's a good example. Olympia Snow is a good example. Kirsten Gillibrand is a good example. I think there are women in the Senate, and we were talking about the Senate, but it's also true in the House. Women do make a difference, and it's not. I mean, it's not like women are all centrist or women are all moderate, and there are very, very conservative women in Congress. And very liberal women in Congress. But there is more of a tendency to be willing to listen to the other side and say, where can we find the ground to come together? And so I do think it makes a difference that we have still too few women in both the House and the Senate. My own observation, whether it's people like Barbara and Nancy, who were very significant players. I mean, when you listen to them, they both see fault on both sides. It's not locked into some ideological warfare. And so that's where women can make a difference. Not because they are smarter, but it's not because they're smarter. but that they come with a different attitude of cooperation. It's just a different personality and mindset.
I'd just like to respond to Nancy on one thing. What she said was absolutely right, but I would take it back a step. The Constitution of the United States of America, the way it is written, and the way our forefathers wanted it to be written, was that there was discussion, time to look at an issue, time to compromise. They didn't want it to be like England, where there was a king, and where the parliament could go at each other like you see on television sometimes to get the British statement. They wanted a much different type of body. And I think that's what is, I'm sure there's some political science teachers here, that I think they, in fact, I talked to some political science teachers and say, oh, it's awful, oh, it's terrible. They should be teaching how we can get out of it and not being a part of the group that says how bad it is. Because, if it's so bad, why aren't you running? More people have to run. To just sit back and say it's terrible, they're doing nothing. I just can't buy that at all. As far as women, I was so excited when that appropriations bill passed with Barbara Mikulski. I was so excited. It was just wonderful. Patty Murray, though. Patty Murray, if she hadn't got the budget through, Barbara couldn't have gone on with the appropriations bill. And Susan Collins, absolutely wonderful, bringing people together. And that was a Republican and Democratic effort. And I think, as we say, women can really cooperate better, I think, sometimes. We just had a military bill where, women having trouble with the Navy, and you know what I'm talking about. And there were two women that put the bill forth, one from Missouri and one from New York. And they really lobbied and tried to get the vote. And the senator from New York didn't win. But the senator from Missouri, the bill went through. All I'm saying, it might not have gone through if some people, you can really, if you know the rules of the Senate and the House, you can really stop things. But bill passed, and maybe everybody didn't agree, but it did pass. But I would say, right at this moment, and I tell my students this, I teach, absolutely this is the moment for women to go into politics. Many of our very Waxman and Miller, wonderful congressmen are leaving. There's going to be open seats. Women should run now. This is a chance for us to get more women. We have to have more women. But the country is, we've got a small percentage more than men in the country. And of course, we have to have more women in Congress. I mean, Nancy and I went, was what, 22 or something like that. I mean, we all had to love each other. I mean, there were so few of us. And I was the first woman, I was the third woman in history on the Ways and Means Committee. And my dear friend from Connecticut was the fourth woman. And you know why that is? I'll tell you why. We had a governor. We had a governor, Ella Grasso, first woman elected in her own right. And once we had a governor and people saw women could govern, then most of the time Nancy and I were in Congress, it was 3-3. Three women and 3 men in the Connecticut delegation. And look at California, 2 women senators. Take a look at New Hampshire. The governor, the Senate, 2 senators, and the 2 representatives. Once you see women govern, it's just acceptable. It was Never an issue with Nancy's in my campaign, never an issue. So this is for me, and this is all my poor students. I think they're going to have to register to run for council again, May. But I really just keep saying to them, don't complain, get involved.
Can I ask one thing? Coming from Oklahoma, which has a woman governor and one of the first women members of Congress, I want to make another point here about why women are very important. And it goes back to what Barbara said about the constitutional system. I spent an hour on the phone yesterday with a reporter from the New York Times who was working on a story about what was wrong because the president is not feared, the speaker and the majority leader in the Senate are not feared, to which my point was, they're not supposed to be feared. The president is, he's not your daddy. He's what's he going to do? What can the speaker do? Take away your parking place? That if you go to the polls and you vote for somebody because you like the way they think and you like their policy positions, you don't want them to get up there and be bossed by somebody who says, no, this is, it takes, I'm sorry, I know the audience, it takes political scientists a lot of time to learn we are not a parliamentary system. And so we need a system that, we need a Congress where we deliberate. It's not about how much you can pass, how fast you can pass it. It's where you talk together, you deliberate, you have hearings, and you think about it, and it takes time to work out the compromises. And women are much better at that. And so, I think that is another thing that having more women in Congress would bring to the table. They would slow down the process, make it more deliberative, more listening, and work it out better than men have been able to do.
I just wanted to mention that the point that Barbara brought up about the two Democrat senators who brought out on the floor two alternative ways of dealing with rape and sexual harassment in the military. You could have had that discussion if it had been one man and one woman. You couldn't have had those two alternatives so clearly considered. And it was really moving to me to see women standing up for what they believed, able to deal with each other respectfully, and fighting for votes for their amendment, just like the men do. See, the world had never seen, the political world in Washington had never seen women compete for everyone's vote in the body for their side. So not only did they have to deal with a ticklish issue, but they had to deal with women in dealing with that issue, and that has never been true. So it's big time.
I'm a political scientist on the panel, not a member of Congress. But I don't want to rain on the parade too much, but I want us to think about how the increasing numbers of women have grown over time. So if you go back to the time when Nancy and Barbara were there, the House was about 10% women. It's now getting close to 20% over those 10 years. So my concern is that we might have to wait 40, 50, 60 years until there are enough women to get us out of the problems that we're in. Unfortunately, I don't think the problems that we're in have a time frame of 40 years. So I'm going to go back to what Barbara was talking about, and I think that if you don't like the way things are developing, then you all have the power to change them, and voters have the power to change them. In Texas, we had an open Senate seat, and so we had a lieutenant governor who was running against someone who used to be Secretary of State, and they agreed on 95% of the issues. The difference between them was one was willing to sit down at a table and try and figure out how to work with Democrats and pass things, and the other one vowed that he never would do that. And so when the Texas voters had a chance to vote for one of these candidates, they elected the warrior. They didn't elect the negotiator. And so the problem isn't necessarily with the institution or the leaders or stuff like that, but with the voters. We've chosen warriors.
The problem was Texas.
Barbara, to my students, that's Barbara Kennelly from Connecticut.
Yeah. Sean, let me make a point though.
Texas has more votes than all of New England combined.
I'm not going to plug my book, but there's another issue here, because you're talking about David Dewhurst and Ted Cruz. And David Dewhurst, the lieutenant governor in Texas, who very popular, actually finished ahead of Ted Cruz in the primary. And then in the runoff, very conservative groups, Jim DeMint's group and all, poured tons of money into Cruz's race, and he beat Dewhurst in the runoff primary. But he got only around 700,000 votes in a state of 26 million people. So the problem is that you have closed party primaries, and then you have sore loser laws, so that Dewhurst was not able to run in the general election. So I'm not sure what the people of Texas would have chosen. I think if you'd given them the opportunity, since 3 million had voted for Dewhurst in previous races, if you'd given all the people the opportunity to choose, David Dewhurst might be in the Senate, and we might not have had a government shutdown.
But they decided to stay home.
They didn't. Right.
Thank you. And also to end this whole Women's History Month thing, I'm going to plug my book. It takes a candidate, Why Women Don't Run for Office, or it still takes a candidate, Why Women Don't Run for Office, depending on whether you want the 2005 or 2010 edition. But the fact of the matter is, we don't have enough women running for office. And in order for them to make significant gains, in any political institution across the country, they actually need to run. There are more than 520,000 elective offices in this country. And so I would also suggest to everybody sitting here today that you at least think about it. You don't have to start out at the US Senate, you don't have to start out at the US Congress. There are dog catchers that need to be elected, and sheriffs and county coroners and auditors of deeds, and a million other things, or 500,000 other things. So I'd at least think about it, because that's the only way that we're gonna be able to fill that pipeline. People will climb the career ladder, and maybe we can bring about some positive change.
Right, she's absolutely right.
But Jen, how do we do that? I mean, your research shows all the way, back down through high school that women just don't want to run. I mean,
So again, very excellent question. So the two biggest barriers are that women who look exactly the same as men on paper don't self-assess as qualified to run for office, and they're more likely than men to let those self-doubts hold them back. But one of those reasons is because the overwhelming majority of people don't know that when women run for office, they do just as well as their male counterparts, both in terms of vote totals and fundraising receipts. So disseminating that message that when women run, they can win, and that's the case in both political parties, is vital. It's hard because there are some very high-profile losses that we're all familiar with that tend to sort of skew how we think about politics. The other thing is women are less likely than men to be recruited to run for office, but they're just as likely to respond favorably when they are. And that suggestion can come from a party leader, an elected official, a political activist, or even a family member, colleague, or friend. So if you don't want to run for office, you have to find several people when you leave here today who you can convince should. So I think thank you all very much. Candy, do you want to conclude?
Thank you all for coming on behalf of the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies and Women Politics Institute. Thank you for coming. Thank you to all of our panelists. It was a very engaged discussion. For those of you who are interested in this topic, CCPS will be sponsoring a conference on May 9th on party polarization. Jen will be participating. Antoine Yoshinaka, our colleague, is organizing it along with Professor Thurber. So we'll hope to see you back on campus in about 6 weeks.
Sean will be participating.
You can hear about the Gingrich senators again? Although, with Nancy's comment, I might revise some of the things I said.
So thank you all, and like I said, we'd love to see you back on campus in about 6 weeks. So thanks everybody.
Oh, of course, yeah, we'll send out a big email.
you will. I'm along that.
Several emails. Oh, yeah. I mean, it's going to go to SBA, it's going to go to...
Okay,
So, absolutely.
good. Because that sounds wonderful.
Yeah, it's going to be a one-day conference.
And on what day?
On Friday, May 9th. Friday commencement weekend.
It would be my graduate students. Because I'm teaching the voting age.
Yeah, no,
And I
absolutely.
think they would really love to.
Absolutely. And we'll send the lineup, Keith Poole's going to be there, Mo Fiorino, Sarah Bender, Francis Lee, Sean, Elena Bramowitz, Jacobson. It's going to be like real people. And I'm just going to,
Wow, that's huge. Well, we should have people coming from other colleges.
Oh yeah, we're reaching the DC area. And we wonder by the end of
If he's
volume.
in time, it's a good time for me.
Well, you'll get
Okay, great.
Good to see you guys.
I think so too. That was lively. Yeah. I love it. I love it. You know, it'd be really nice to have them come together for my women's talk. Oh yeah. You know, women's talk, public policies. Yeah. I think that. Yeah. I think that would be absolutely fantastic. Yeah. I mean, it's as sharp as it's happening. I mean, on top of everything. I think incredible. Yeah. I read it. Wow. I was just so impressed. No, I think that would be great because, you know, it's important because I teach politics right now. It's important to see how effective they are. Yes. Well, number one, substance differences, so I think that and also, you know, I was really touched by what you were saying about, you know, the Jill Grant fight with Senator Harris. You know, I thought that was, you know, she had just such brilliant insight into that. So that would be good. Also, you know, how much
I'm somehow
and
I'm not sure if we talked. I thought
that's one thing we're working about.
I mean, yeah, I was like, I want both because if I do take it
they want to be satisfied. But at the end of the day, I think, hi sweetie, you're great. Yeah, really good. I think that, you know,
I did. So it was the community college. I was community college in Schenectady, and it was the spring of '96. Yes. So I think you were getting ready.
You were wonderful. We were just, oh, is that right?
So I
we were just talking about
Rhode Island. I lived in Rhode Island against a Democratic incumbent in the primary. So I got 40% of the vote. But like,
You were really good.
like I feel like this was the path to victory.
Oh, is that right?
Yes.
Yes, even if it's not like one of my favorite people in the world. One of mine too. That's really nice. Wonderful. But you know, I was just telling Andy with our government
Right. It also, I mean, I can honestly say it made me such a better, I don't know if it made me a better political scientist, but certainly it makes me a better professor. I like great just saying everything like
for the, it's a combined task of master's and undergraduate. And very often, but they're really
and you teach me. Politics of the students.
I'd love to come. You know, we need to talk about that.
the evening class.
Yeah. This thing about
Thank you very much.
It was great.
Hi. Good, how are you?
It's just that like I was doing
You were the person in the audience. I think it was. I was actually an actor, so but I know they write things. Yeah, so when you're such a and I was saying when you're this, I just
Yeah, no, you're right.
I love to get together.
Okay.
Wonderful. Well, this is great.
Women interested in getting
It's a very I'll send an email with the room. I think it's. I already associated that. Okay. Okay, great.
Terrific. I was checking the truths about but I think one of the meta studies does say how much but I don't want to hold you up. But I want to say goodbye to Elizabeth. Goodbye.
So nice to meet you, Barbara. You were so fabulous. You know, and I'm going to be teaching a course on policy next year in fall. Yeah, I'm
You were good.
To change the title, of course.
I think you're so right. You're so right. I mean, yeah.
Liz, is this one yours?
Yes, it is. Huh?
Put your book here.
Yeah.
And I'm moderating the panel.
Really?
Because I got criticized once I was
Yeah.
she had.
Really? Okay. I'm going to get it. Okay, thank you. And I will call you in the fall. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming.
Former intern. Yes, I realized
Hi, nice to see you.
she's run for Congress.
I did in Rhode Island. Yeah, so I taught at Brown for 6 years. And while I was there, yeah.
Experience.
It was an amazing experience. It was. It was.
But you speak so I do it again. He's living in Washington. Yeah. I used to say that in a lot of my talks. But you
Sometimes I kind of like my job, right? Like, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for inviting us. This is really very helpful.
It was my pleasure.
I see your books all the time,
Oh,
so
thank
you know.
you.
Well, thank you. Oh yeah. Well, yes.
Oh, I will send. I'll send you. It's harder.
We go through, we're always looking for new text material because she comes at her classes kind of a little differently than the standard poli-sci person does. So we're always looking for
So
material.
I'm actually writing a new book right now. It's called Turned Off, and it's why the next generation doesn't want to run for office and what we can do about it.
She's just writing it. It's not out yet.
But we're actually doing it where our ideal audience are people like at an airport. Like it's not written for academics.
Yeah.
We want average people who are politically interested to think that this is what they should do. I know. So once you're already established professionally, you get to then do the fun stuff. So
that's a different skill from the speaking.
there are enough offices. Anyway, thank you very much.
One woman was so good at the asking. She got good at the asking for donors. But the campaign manager got well said I was done. She thought she didn't need work for the other stuff, but she did. She was 7 votes.
Really that box.
This is a state Senate race in Virginia. And I heard on radio Virginia politics, they were talking about people said she just
Chocolate is a lot easier to resist.
Well, I can fix that though, because a theater background was a speaker trained. I can say, this is how you fix it. She was arrogant, but she didn't need a telegraph.
Right. In that situation, and I still beat myself.
Who are you playing?
She lost the thing to Janelle Perry. Almost.
Oh, this is Janet.
Yes.
Yeah, well, her husband teaches here.
I mean, she was doing really well. She was doing well. She knew more about what she knew more about her stuff than a lot of people. But it's going to affect family again, where it's so with her campaign, so I'm trying to figure that out. But let me give you my contact info too.
Oh, yeah.
In case you
Great.
Yeah. Terrific. I'm going to use her name because that's